So I'm Rebecca Jamil. I'm really happy to be here today. And as Jeff said, I've worn a lot of different hats in the immigration arena. I started out working for the Ninth Circuit as a staff attorney, which means you work with sort of all the judges in a rotating set of panels, and I did only immigration cases. I knew I always wanted to do immigration since I went to law school at University of Washington, and I did an immigration clinic there. Then I went to a part of my career that most people don't talk about right now. I went to ICE in San Francisco. I was an attorney who represented the government in removal proceedings, and I was there for 5 years. About 3 years into that, I realized I really wanted to be an immigration judge. I applied for the job and I got it. And I was appointed by Loretta Lynch to be an IJ in 2016. Things did not go as I thought they were going to go. And after the election, things changed pretty drastically. And so I resigned from my post effective July 2018. Now I am in private practice in San Francisco. I do that part-time. I have 2 little kids, so I do that the other part of the time. So I had kind of a quick evolution. I thought I'd be a judge forever, and I was not. And I think I've worn pretty much every hat in the immigration arena, and I'm excited to talk to this group of people today. When I was preparing to moderate the discussion among everyone here today, I was thinking about what brings us together, why immigration is such a hot topic now. And I feel like some of the big things that have been in the news and fallen out that are happening still right now we still have Muslim debate. People don't realize this. We see clients in our office, they're Muslims from many countries, they're still banned from the United States, separating families that way. Their families still separated at our borders regularly, come from all over the world. Over 40,000 people are waiting in Mexico for their immigration court hearings. And as of yesterday, they might not ever, some of them, get the opportunity to apply for asylum. And there are people in our community, people with DACA, who live in fear of deportation every day. So I wouldn't say that things are super rosy in the immigration community. And it seems often like there's no bottom. It can be a pretty hard place to work every day. But there are lots of people that are doing really good, difficult things. And I feel like those people that are doing those things feel vulnerable in our community. That's what kind of keeps me going. And I always love those stories. And you see them on social media sometimes. There's so many attorneys working pro bono to protect immigrants and refugees. I saw that all the time in my program. Often the best attorneys were from nonprofits like Carolina, who's on our panel today. And you see churches offering sanctuary to immigrants who are vulnerable to deportation. You also see, we saw this a lot when there was that threat from the current president. There was a threat of raids were going to happen a couple months ago, that immigrants and people in the community knew their rights, that you can't just bang down a door and take someone. So I feel like that's another positive thing that's come out lately, is that people know their rights and they're protecting their neighbors. And you also see protests, and you see people protecting their neighbors and really wanting to demand change in these trying times. So things are not as bad as they seem. And that's why we're here today, to get a nuanced sense of the picture of the whole immigration landscape from our distinguished panelists, who I will introduce now. We already know Jeff. He's an immigration attorney. I know him from my days at ICE. I know him from when I was a judge, and he appeared before me often. And I just went out, but here we go. And he's also the founder of Global Pathways. Sitting next to him is New Latthivongskorn. He's the founder of Pre-Health Dreamers, and he's also a resident in family medicine at UCSF, and he is a DACA recipient. Next to New is Ramirez, who is also a former immigration judge. And next to Laura is Carolina Martin Ramos, who is the Director of Programs and Advocacy at Centro Legal de la Raza. So let's get started. And I'd like for every one of our panelists to talk a little bit about their background and why you're so passionate about immigration. And why don't we start with you, Jeff?
I'm an immigration attorney. I started about 10 years ago. And the reason I got into immigration was because I was looking for, I came out of law school, I didn't know what to do. Nothing seemed to satisfy me. And I started doing some cases, pro bono cases for refugees from Africa. And it was I was starting to work with people who I had never worked with before and hear about the world that I had never heard about. And after doing several of these cases, I decided I wanted to go into immigration law and devote myself to it. Over the years, I decided that the most fascinating aspect to me in immigration is working with people, refugees from around the world, asylum seekers, and so that's what my practice now specializes in. And so I have a law practice in Berkeley, and the reason why Global Path was founded is because we decided to use technology to try to reach as many people as possible, because unfortunately there are not enough immigration advocates to support everyone who needs them.
Hello everybody. Thank you for the introduction. So a little bit more about myself. I am originally from Thailand. That's where I was born and where I lived until growing up for now the past 20 years of my life in California. I grew up as an undocumented immigrant. I still am. But for many, many years, I lived with what that meant, not knowing what all the policies and the laws that affected my life, the life of my family, my community meant. Oftentimes it meant living in fear of what could happen all the time. It really wasn't until I was in college at UC Berkeley, and that was when I got connected to a few local nonprofit organizations. One called Educators for Consideration, and now called Immigrants Rising. And that was really the first time I met other undocumented immigrants who were not my family members or family friends, and really shifted my way of thinking in terms of what it means to be undocumented. That it doesn't have to mean isolation and fear, that you can really feel like you have a community of support, of resources to turn to when you have needs and you have problems that arise. And so, anyways, fast forward many, many years from then, I co-founded Pre-Health Dreamers, which is an organization to help undocumented students who want to pursue careers in health. Myself included, I'm now a medical resident trainee to become a doctor to provide care to underserved communities and in our state here at the General Hospital. And I sort of kind of try to live every day now, trying to use my personal experiences to inform my work experiences. Because I've seen many, many ways that immigration and injustice has played a role in immigrant communities' lives.
Yes, I use this one. Okay. So Rebecca and I know each other from being immigration judges together. I was an immigration judge for 21 years. Rebecca appeared before me as a government attorney. She was one of my favorites. And Jeffrey also appeared before me. I was telling him already he was one of our favorites also. We do have favorites. I can say that now. I couldn't say that before. I started doing immigration law when I graduated from law school in '85. It was a natural choice for me because I'm from Chicago and my grandparents were immigrants and their situation was a very big part of the life of our family. And when I was quite young, two of my grandparents who were from Mexico were put in deportation proceedings, which was called there in those days, and they lost their residency and returned to Mexico. So that was something that it was always in my consciousness. So I grew up, I went to law school, And I began working with asylees in San Francisco, and I worked at nonprofits representing immigrants, and I taught a little bit at Santa Clara University, and I helped them set up their clinic. All the time working in the nonprofit field, doing immigration law, you realize that there's never enough. There's not enough people doing that work. There's a huge supply of people who need representation, and so that's part of my interest in mobile pathways. And also as an immigration judge, especially the last couple of years, there was a surge, and that's what it was called, of people at the border. There continues to be a lot of people at the border in a much worse situation than they were in 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, whenever, 2014, I think was the first surge. But I'm less optimistic than Rebecca about things getting better. And that's why I stopped being an immigration judge, because when I started in 1985, people were not that interested in immigration law. People would say, you do what? What? You know, nobody knew what being an immigration lawyer was. And now it's something that's on the evening news every night, and not for the right reasons. And I felt like me and my community and the work I was interested in had become the target of Washington in a very bad way. And I'm hoping that something positive can come, that people can be empowered to take care of their immigration needs through mobile pathways and through people coming together to advocate and support that community.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Carolina Martin Ramos. It's nice to be here with everyone. So I do work in the nonprofit sector right now. I'm the Director of Programs and Advocacy at Centro Legal de la Raza in Fruitville, District of Oakland. I started my career, because really I grew up with a mother who came here undocumented from Mexico, and I grew up in a mixed status family. So this is something really personal to me. You know, when I was in law school, I knew that I wanted to do something related to civil rights or human rights. And I had family members who were longtime legal permanent residents who were facing deportation for misdemeanor convictions. And since I was little, you know, when you grow up in a mixed status family or you grow up in an immigrant family, a lot of time you're pushed forward to advocate from a very young age. So your family might say, Mija, diles, right? They push you forward to be a little interpreter, or to, Mija, look, what is this paper we got from the landlord? What does it say? I was a young person here in the Mission District in the 80s and 90s, and even community members would stop me in the street. Mija, what does this say? What does this mean? So I always knew from a young age that I was supposed to use my status, my privilege, to step up and advocate. And I just feel like there's never been a time where they haven't needed me. And as long as my family and community are still behind me saying, Mija, help us, please interpret this, advocate for us, then I feel like I have to. Again, as a law student, you know, it was in my first year of law school, but my family said, hey, you're the only one who can help us with this. My mom had a middle school education from Mexico, so it really was up to me. And, you know, I've been practicing immigration law for about 10 years now, and it's weighed on me quite a bit. I think at this point, when we practice for so many years, we're carrying a lot of people's stories and trauma, and that can get really heavy. You know, we have obligations to, you know, confidentiality and to protect those stories, but we certainly experience a lot of what we call secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. I spent the last 5 years on the San Diego-Tijuana border region, so I was right there in the middle of the surge that the Honorable Judge was just mentioning. In 2014, I was the second attorney into the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Artesia, New Mexico for that surge. And each time I heard people's stories of persecution and torture. Also in 2018, I traveled to Guatemala to find parents that were separated from their children and deported. Most of them were indigenous Mayan people, Quiche Maya, Quechua Maya, Ishi Maya, and they were monolingual indigenous speakers who couldn't advocate from rural pueblos and try to find their children detained in OR facilities in South Texas. So I went down and found them and started working with them and representing them. In San Diego, I worked with the American Bar Association Immigration Justice Project. We managed the legal orientation program in Otay Mesa Detention Center, very familiar with detention centers. And also was the director of the Victims of Crime program for Casa Cornelia Law Center, working with victims of labor trafficking and other severe forms of trafficking. So I think we all, probably, have just from our hearts, feel that when you work that closely with people and heard about their suffering, you really do feel like you have to do this work, no matter how exhausting and hard it might be. Thank you for caring and for coming out to listen.
So, Carolina, you're actually getting to the next point that I wanted to talk to everyone about, which is what do you see that the biggest challenge during this administration is within your work and with the communities that you work with? And so I'll ask you first, maybe, because I know that you work in a slightly different space than maybe the rest of us on the panel.
There's so many ways.
It's a big question.
It's been impacted. So I would say the two realms which I work around immigration with immigrant communities is one through education. And I think I mentioned our work with pre-college dreamers is really the whole reason we were founded was because there's such a big need for resources, for information, for support in terms of navigating higher education. So for so many years, undocumented youth have found ways to get through undergraduate level education, and then the sort of graduate professional level became the next step in many ways, and it was very uncharted territory. And so we've done a lot of work in that, and I think we've seen kind of the different policies of this current administration really chip away at a lot of the progress that we've made in that realm. I also see this through the lens of working with health and access to healthcare and public health. For example, here in California, nationally, there's a recent kind of proposed rule, the public charge rule, that is trying to redefine kind of the rules around when immigrants apply to adjust their status and get a green card. If somebody has, so prior to this, it's not a big rule that if you've ever accessed a public program, a benefit like Medicaid, that it would ever be used against you, and that's been a recent proposed change that now it could be. And it will come into effect October 15th, I believe, at this point, and there have been some lawsuits to even sort of go against that. But those are some of the few different ways that I've seen.
Thank you. How about you, Laura?
There's a lot of, one of my frustrations thank you. One of my frustrations as an immigration judge is with attorneys who represent respondents, because they don't really respond to the needs of their client globally in a way that, in my opinion, they should be. And to give you an example, when we had the surge, we were in a building here in the financial district, and the jurisdiction of the court is from Bakersfield to the Oregon border. So you have people coming from all over California virtually, and many of them live in rural communities and come from rural communities. And you get a family of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, they get on the elevator with us, and their eyes would go really big because they had never been on an elevator before. And if you're representing people from rural communities who are not used to using public transportation in a big city, not used to obtaining services, they need a little bit of social work in addition to legal representation, which there is very little of any. So, and I remember when I was a lawyer, I would have people say to me, you know, my child has this serious illness, but I don't want to take them to the doctor because then I'll get denied my immigration benefit. And in the old days, I would just say, take care of the health first and I'll do the lawyering that needs to be done to make sure that that's not an issue. And now I don't know what you say. You know, it's a terrible crisis that people are going to be avoiding necessary social services and medical services out of fear of immigration, which the goal is the cruelty. Cruelty is the goal. Sorry, not an optimist.
Carly.
So how things changed? It feels like we're at war. It really does. A lot of people say that. It's very difficult. For instance, I mentioned that I worked as the director of Victims of Crime program. We used to file what we call petitions for U non-immigrant status and T non-immigrant status for victims of serious crime, victims of human trafficking. In those days, people were always afraid, hey, you know, if you file this petition for me and it gets denied, is there any risk that I could be deported? In the old days, I could say, you know, no, unless you have some serious criminal conviction, you're safe. The Vermont Service Center will, USCIS will just, you know, they won't give you the benefit, but they're not going to pass your information to ICE. Well, that's changed. There's been a memorandum, and the government advises us now that if they deny those benefits, they will pass that information to ICE and put that person in deportation proceedings. You know, I was on the border where Border Patrol and CBP was turning people away and metering people who, and I should say these are asylum seekers, not just any people, who are actually doing what they're supposed to. It's in black and white, you know, law that if you want to apply for asylum, you have to do it at a port of entry or in the United States. So they would come to the port of entry at the, what we call the Garita in Mesa or San Isidro, and they would say, I'm afraid that I could be tortured or persecuted if I'm returned to my home country. And Border Patrol started saying, well, too bad, because Trump doesn't have asylum anymore. I mean, Border Patrol agents were actually saying things like that. That's violating international human rights law and our own. Government. I mean, the types of human rights and civil rights violations that people, you know, told me about were really atrocious. So it's very different than it was a few years ago.
So how do we go about, as a legal community, meeting these sort of unprecedented challenges for as legal service providers. I mean, you're on the front lines. You're with one of the best legal services providers in the Bay Area. How do you go about meeting this unprecedented and ever-changing sort of cruel legal environment?
I wish I had the answer. By having folks like you care. We're really pushing and fighting for what we call universal representation. In the immigration court, you have a right to have an attorney, but you have to pay for that attorney. And most folks don't have attorneys or resources to hire an attorney. With the consequences that people are facing, with legal permanent residents facing being deported after living here their whole lives, and asylum seekers facing torture, upon their return to their home countries, it's really important that we think more seriously as a society about protecting non-citizens' rights to due process, and really look at what's going on in the immigration courts and system here.
I think that's a good point. I think most people don't realize that you have a right to representation in court, but no one's going to provide it to you. And so you're hoping that a nonprofit will take your case for free, but nonprofits are utterly overburdened. Everyone wants their resources. Everyone wants an attorney through them, and people go to private attorneys who are of wildly varying quality. And most people can't afford what a private attorney charges. They can ask their whole family members, they can go on payment plans. So universal representation, which I think they have in New York City, and I think they just got increased funding for it maybe yesterday. And I think that's the only city doing universal representation for immigration court, and it's the city funding immigration court, which it's the Federal Department of Justice. But I mean, that means little kids coming to court without lawyers in other cities. So Laura, did you have anything you might want to add about representation and how as a community and as a country we go about people having representation in these really important proceedings?
I don't have an answer, but I do have experience. I was, sometimes the immigration judges are sent around, and I spent a week in New York City doing detained cases, and all the cases that came before me had attorneys, and it made an amazing difference. I mean, and they were, I guess it's the city of New York, maybe the state of New York. I think it may be only detained cases that have representation. I'm not sure about that, but it was, I mean, you sometimes hear that if you don't have an attorney, you'll lose your case in immigration court, and I think it makes me a little defensive as a former immigration judge that we're not that cruel that we just deport people because they don't have attorneys. But to be able to put your case together and do what you need to do to present the evidence, you really need an attorney. It's a complex area of law, and somehow it should be funded. I mean, and it's wrong to be putting people who are not necessarily familiar with anything to do with our legal system in a situation where they have to defend themselves in life-altering circumstances.
So I think this might be a nice segue for Jeff, for you to talk a little bit about the information and how that Mobile Pathways can provide, and how that's sort of a bridge of legal information and how that interacts with attorney representation in immigration court.
Sure. So one of the things I noticed we do, my practice is a fairly high volume of cases, and so we work with lots of people every day, and we're telling them the same information because the cases, all of the facts are always different, the same procedures and the same legal requirements are standard for all cases. And so over 10 years of being in my office, I was basically saying the same things over and over. And if you were to ever go to immigration court in what's called a master calendar hearing, you hear the judges say the same things over and over. And it's almost, I imagine it would be very frustrating to have to say the same things. And that's the judges, but people will come in, they don't understand what to do, and so you have to tell them about their change of address, and you have to tell them what documents they need to bring, and then you have to tell them to bring an attorney, and then they come back next time, and you have to tell them all over again. And then the government has to make photocopies, and so there's a tremendous amount of redundancies. And so the opportunity that I discovered, or I see basically, because it's right in front of all of us, is that we can replicate a lot of these redundancies by using technology, right? So everyone who came to my office, basically, these days everyone has a cell phone. And so what our office started doing is we started using technology to send them text messages with information about their court cases, and we could automate a lot of it. And we had systems that would do calculations for us. This is all based on Salesforce technology, which is one of the reasons why we're here. And so I discovered that if we can do this for our clients, we should build that out and share it with everyone. Because there's, I don't know if you have the statistics, but I've seen 30% of people perhaps have representation in court. And so many cases that are lost are lost on very simple things. For example, one of the things that 46,000 people reported for last year was for not, or removed, as they call it, for what are called in absentia orders, people who don't appear in court. And a lot of that is because people don't have the information. We can go into why they don't have the information, that's another story. But that's a very simple fact. They need to know the date and the place. If they don't have it, then the government wins that case by default because the person didn't show up. And so these types of things are easily transmitted to people because they all have cell phones.
So what kind of information? I agree that in absentia, these orders that can be entered if someone just doesn't show up to court, the government can prove on paper that they received their notice. So they, just because they didn't show up for whatever reason, they get a removal order, they don't know about it. And in reality, they probably never knew about it. Their hearing date changed 5 times before since they got to the United States. So what kind of information do they get through legal pathways? Do they get just every time the hearing date changes, they get a little ping on their cell phone? Is that the idea?
So, yes, so this is the first tool we developed. There's an 800 hotline. The government provides notice by mail, and I don't know if any of you got the most important document in your entire life by mail. But if you don't get that, then it's over. So the government sends it by mail, but they also have an 800 phone number that you can call, but you have to repeatedly call that day after day to understand, to know if the court date has changed. So that was our first program, to call that number, to set up a system, to call that number, and then text them updates for court hearings. But so many simple things are routine in court. What kind of documents do I need to bring? Do I need to bring my children there? What is the judge going to ask me? What do I need to say? What kind of application? All these things, you don't have to have a full conversation with someone to know. You don't have to talk to a lawyer. It needs to be easily transmitted.
So I want to sort of switch gears a little bit and try and turn towards how do we, something that is near and dear to my heart because one of my close friends is undocumented. I've known him 20 years. He's very active in this space, and his focus is how do we get people to care about immigration who are not part of our little insular world of immigration judges and immigration attorneys. And so I'm going to ask you as sort of more part of that space of how do we get people to care about immigration so when we emerge out of this dark place, we can really start to reform things in a meaningful way, and we can really have change. Because I'm confident someday that will happen, but maybe that's some other little kids of me.
I think it has to start with having conversations, having dialogue. I think, for example, I think back to, I am a DACA recipient, and September 5th, 2017 was when Jeff Sessions announced that they were going to rescind the program. And it really was, what struck me was the way that they framed it, right? The reasons for ending it. And it's really kind of playing off on stereotypes and the ideas that immigrants in this country are are kind of drained to the system, don't have the right to be here, don't have the right to get anything, and then even that in itself, you fall into the pitfall of good versus bad immigrants. Then you try to separate, like, these are the deserving people and these are the undeserving. And I think it's being able to understand how much more complex it all is. And I think you can do that through, again, like having dialogue, trying to understand, like, who are the people who are undocumented, who are refugees, like, what are their real life experiences like, to really understand one part of it. And then the other part is then connecting it to how it may, how what we all do every single day, whether it's through our personal lives or our work, how that may intersect and how that may have an impact. I think one of my hopes is through all of this is that there's now kind of a new level of frustration by everybody, but also kind of level of awareness, knowledge about all the injustice and all the things that are wrong. My hope is that we can then use that to motivate ourselves and work together to create the changes that we want to see.
Thank you. Laura, did you want to comment?
I think we're in a terrible time, and I'm hoping the pendulum, that people will have seen the effect of this. I mean, although I'm a pessimist, my husband will tell you, he's the optimist in the family, but the 40,000 people at the border applying for asylum, I think are a bit invisible right now. I mean, I watch the news, I'm following what's happening, and I'm worried that it's easy to not see them. I think people are now aware of what the issue is in a kind of vibrant way. I'm hoping that something good will come of that after this is over.
I agree. Carolina?
I was thinking about, I'm mestiza and I've lived and worked with a lot of indigenous communities in the United States and south of the border. And something important to sort of indigenous worldviews is this concept of all our relations and interrelatedness. And I think I myself see that as sort of really key in going forward of understanding our relationships to each other. Even when I went to Guatemala, it really was eye-opening. I heard stories from asylum seekers here in the United States, but actually going to those communities and building those relationships. I saw the palm plantations where people were subjected to forced labor, and I saw how our consumption of palm oil impacted what's happening in Guatemala and how those people were being forced off of their ancestral lands, and now their lives are being threatened. I think we have to understand our relationship to those folks that are in Tijuana right now as part of the Migrant Protection Protocols program. Maybe we too, who work in this, need to do a better job of trying to tell the stories.
I think that's a great point and a good point to wrap our part of the discussion up on. But now we invite all of you to ask us questions. And I'll remind everyone there's no bad question, at least until I tell you it's bad. So,
You ready?
Yes.
My name is Woodson. I work at Salesforce. I am also on the board of an organization called Team Brownsville. We work in Brownsville and Matamoros. Over the last 12 days, we've averaged 650 people a day that we fed, 2 meals a day, 1,500 bottles of water, did a lot of plastic. I meet a lot of people who are stuck in our process today. And I'm interested, maybe if we could spend a minute understanding better this phenomenon of MPP that is having such a big effect today, and also the Supreme Court ruling yesterday, and maybe a perspective from the judges or the attorneys on the panel about what advice do we have for the people who are at the border today, and whether they should cross right now. Should they go when their number comes up in Tijuana or San Luis or Matamoros, or should they wait? Because I've got a good friend from Cameroon who he can't go back or anything. So just asking that question, how do you think about these very recent changes and what we should be doing in these border regions?
Carolina, do you want to field this? Because I know you've done work on the border. I don't want to throw all of these to you.
Right, and maybe one of the folks from the judiciary branch can talk more about what happened yesterday with the East Bay V-Bar case. Let's see, so the MVP program. That we have to observe, and our own laws. I mean, like you said, you can't tell people like, oh, don't come, go back to Cameroon where Anglophones in Cameroon are being persecuted and tortured, right? And you can't tell a transgender woman who's been brutalized by Mexican police that she should go back. Gosh, this is really hard. Can you ask me again kind of what was really your question of what we can do for the asylum seekers at the border?
So conditions have changed a lot.
Yes.
I think that the math on probability of success in an asylum case has dramatically changed over the last 2 months and over the last 24 hours. And I guess part of my question is an interpretation of the rules, which maybe is for the judges. The advice I feel like we have been categorically giving for a year or more on how to play the process, right? Like how to best secure a solid approach to asylum case seems to maybe have gone out the window. And I'm just wondering, are there any thoughts on like
Okay, so I think one thing that we've done that's really positive and that's changed our practice is a lot more attorneys are actually going into Mexico, right? So I would go into Tijuana and go to the shelters or go to Guatemala. And I was an asylum officer in the Los Angeles Asylum office, so I know how to adjudicate asylum cases. And so I would go down there and screen folks in the shelters in Tijuana and try to determine whether they had a viable asylum claim, and then I would prepare them for their credible fear interview. So that's a really important piece that I think we need to invest more in.
So my understanding is as of yesterday, as of the Supreme Court's decision yesterday, people who did not seek asylum in Mexico, they are no longer going to be given a credible fear interview if they are not Mexican. And if they are Salvadoran or if they're from Honduras, or those people are not going to be given a credible fear interview because they did not try to get asylum on the way to the United States, to put it very bluntly. They're still going to be eligible for withholding removal or protection under the Convention Against Torture, which is obviously very lesser relief, much harder to get, doesn't lead to a green card or citizenship. I think that late today, asylum officers were given guidance on how to apply it. I didn't read it because I was at work, my clients we don't have clients right now who are in that position, but that's my understanding of it, and it's a temporary, this is allowing the law to go into effect while the court is still considering, so it may be temporary, this may be the law going into effect permanently. So that's my understanding of the posture of the decision.
Yes.
But it's barbaric, it's ridiculous. People are now going to be waiting, people who are waiting in Mexico, and these are people with I mean, I haven't met every single one of these people, but this was my docket when I was a judge, was all women and kids, and I mean, it was an incredibly difficult docket to have really no variety from that. It was all women and kids, families who are fleeing horrible violence, and this is exactly that's the profile of people who are waiting, on the other side of the border, and so it's horrific. I can't, it's like Carolina spoke about the secondary trauma that you have as an attorney, and as a judge you get that too, definitely. And I don't know how Laura did it for so long, because after 2.5 years, and my husband was like, I don't care if you quit, it's fine, I'm sick of seeing you just like crumbling. So yeah, it's terrible. Did we address your question sufficiently?
Sure.
I have a slight.
I don't think there's an answer, so.
Well, I just wonder, procedurally, I know that in the southern border of Mexico, they will hear your asylum application in Tapachula. Because I think if you get denied asylum in Mexico, then you can come and apply here. But is there a place at the northern border where they'll?
My understanding is that they don't have the infrastructure to handle, not even close to the volume, but there is some infrastructure. Unlike I know in Guatemala and Honduras, there's like almost no infrastructure to handle the applications of the volume of people. I mean, much less they're actually, being a refugee in those countries, if that's similar to the refugee system here. So that's my.
As an immigration judge, I would see Cameroonians with a little piece of paper from the Mexican government saying, sort of like, you have permission to walk to the northern border. And it's the equivalent, I considered it the equivalent of a denial of asylum, because that was what was happening in that area. So that's a wild guess from someone who hasn't done any immigration law since December.
And for the tech people in the audience, it's the equivalent of what we're dealing with right now as immigration practitioners, people who are observing immigration. It's the equivalent of like when they walk in their work and they're saying, we're going to change your code, we're actually starting to do a different code today. And so I know you have some background in whatever, C++ or whatever, but we're actually going to change that completely. And so that's what you're seeing right now is us having to brainstorm on a very regular basis about how things are operating. The government is actually, so asylum officers, judges, they're actually going through the same thing right now within the departments.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Go ahead.
Well, I'm a negotiation law side. I'm a retired Los Angeles Superior Court judge, and I had long observed that your immigration courts are overwhelmed with cases, even more so than the trial courts and appellate courts in California. I've wondered if that is partly because you're a creature of the Department of Justice rather than being a magistrate court within Article 3. And so if you were magistrate judges, it seems to me that branch could advocate for greater resources for you and for greater numbers of you. And I was just wondering if there's been any thought given to lobbying for that kind of change.
You speak to that.
We have been lobbying for it. Speaking of the old immigration judges, that up until September 11th of 2001, we were trying to get out of the Department of Justice and to become independent. And then after September 11th, they created the Department of Homeland Security. They wanted to put the immigration court into that department, and we stopped trying to get out of the Department of Justice for that time period. So that was the temporary switch, and we do have actual lobbyists in Washington who are working with interested legislators in trying to create an independent court. And it's been endorsed by the American Bar Association and the Federal Bar Association and various other entities who have looked into. It definitely needs to be out of the Department of Justice because it's politicized now more than ever.
Any other questions? Last question, go ahead.
What's the optimistic reach of mobile pathways? How many people do you hope to contact you and help with the tools that you're building?
Well, that's a good question. I think, so we're starting with people who are refugees, asylum seekers, because they need it the most. They're very frequently indigent, they can't afford attorneys. I don't know the number that are in immigration court. There are nearly 1 million people in immigration court. The cost to send messages is less than a penny. So the reach, and using the technology that we have, the reach is nationwide. Beyond that, there are 10, 12 million people in the United States who also don't have permanent status, and many of them also may have emotions. So that's the distinction between 1 million people in court and then 10 or 12 million people living without any kind of papers, let's say. And distributing information to those individuals is equally easy. We just have to organize ourselves to do it, but the cost is very low. The reach is very wide.
All right. It's time for the reception. Thanks so much for listening to all of us talk. We really enjoyed it.